this morning we're kicking off, as Rob mentioned, our new series on the Gospel of John entitled Holy John-oly. And my prayer is simple. My prayer is that you will have moments all throughout this series where the Spirit of God touches you or speaks to you and you're just like, Holy John-oly. And this morning we're beginning with the first 18 verses of this gospel. And I've got to say that this passage is amongst the most profound and consequential in the entire Bible. Big call, but I mean it. And so I just want to dive straight in this morning. Otherwise, this may be on my 100th sermon, the first time that I ever crack an hour. Just teasing. Not really. You know, one of the things that we do when trying to understand any type of communication, especially when that communication hasn't been directed to us, is to seek context, right? Our kid or our colleague gets into an altercation and we start asking questions like this. Who said that? Why would they say that? What did you do that may have prompted them to say that? Anyone ever had those conversations before? And why we ask those questions is because we're seeking context, right? You see, you can interpret a message or totally misconstrue a meaning if you don't have context, and the meaning or the message ends up being nothing like what it actually is. For instance, I took this photo of a note that was on Neen's desk, Pastor Neen's desk, the other week. Now, with no context, who knows that this looks a little worrying? I mean, this is a list of things that Neen had purchased on the church debit card. And just in case you can't read, number 2 is itemized as tobacco. Wow. Like if you see this, I'm not letting you have a right of reply. If you see this without any context, who knows, that's a bit worrying. Who knows, you're thinking, oh dear, I think we're going to have a little conversation here, Pastor Neen. However, with a little bit of context, she's going to be careful about what she leaves on her desk from now. With a little bit of context, suddenly you realize that tobacco isn't specifying a product itself, but the tobacco shop that flowers and a get well card were purchased from in order to bless and encourage someone in our community. Context matters, right? Well, the same is true when we approach the Gospel of John. For instance, John only includes 7 miracles in his entire Gospel. Did you know that? John only includes 7. Now, just to give you some context, the other Gospels have over 30. What is going on here, John? Like, is he shortchanging us? Is he being lazy? Did he run out of papaya? I mean, what's going on? Well, the number 7, as many of you may know, is incredibly significant in the Bible, right? It means, or it has this connotation of wholeness or completeness or perfection. And John, being the artistic and articulate genius, seriously, that he was, actually structures the entirety of his gospel around this theme of the number 7. Just as a subtle but powerful way of reaffirming and ratifying that this gospel that he's writing to those who listen and believe will bring completeness or wholeness. And that's why there's only 7 miracles in John's gospel. That's why there's 7 separate witnesses that testify to Jesus' identity and work in his gospel. That's why there's 7 women that have an encounter with Jesus in his gospel. That's why Pilate, when interrogating Jesus, asks, you guessed it, 7 questions of Jesus. That's why there's 7 I am statements that Jesus makes about himself. I am the bread, I am the vine. You see, context matters. And one of the things that's important to note when understanding John's prologue or introduction, the first 18 verses of this gospel, is the context of who and why he even writes this. John 20, verse 30 and 31 says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You see, while John is certainly not suggesting that his gospel is redundant for believers, John's gospel has a clear evangelistic purpose to it, right? So that people may believe in Jesus and in so doing find life. And so because of this, we have to recognize John's audience. He's writing to convince or to compel those who don't believe, both Jew and Gentile. And so he writes in a way that attempts to capture the heart or the worldview of both Greek philosophy and Judaism. They're the 2 umbrella mindsets or worldviews that John is writing to, that John is attempting to compel with his message of the gospel. And so everything that he writes is informed by this. The way he writes is designed to reach both worldviews, which honestly is no easy task because they're very much polar opposite. But when we understand this, when we begin to realize why John uses certain words, and those words we've possibly read 1,000 times ourselves, those words begin, because of context, to take on new meaning. So let's start. John starts with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, if you're a Jew or a Hebrew, and this is audience participation here, what's significant, or what's the significance of starting with in the beginning? Creation. It's the first few words of the entire Bible, right? In fact, it's actually more pertinent than that. Did you know that the first book of the Bible, Genesis, is the Hebrew word bereshit, which actually is translated as in the beginning? In the beginning. You see, a Jew would have heard this and instantly been engaged. In fact, the Jew would have heard this whole phrase, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and they would have been like, yeah, I'm down with that. That's good, that's cool. But here's the amazing part. So would a Greek. You see, John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, but he uses the Greek word logos. Now, catch this. No other writer at no other time in the entire Bible ever uses this word in connection with God. But John does. Why? Because to the Greek, the logos was kind of like Mother Nature. That was kind of what the logos was to a Greek. It was kind of like the Force from Star Wars, right? The Greeks believed that the universe was controlled or sustained by this abstract principle or this creative force known as the Logos. And so for a Greek, they would have heard the first line of this gospel and also thought, yeah, I'm good with that too. Like, how clever is John, right? Meeting both worldviews in the same sentence. Now, while John's monologue doesn't go where each camp is anticipating, John continues to use imagery and language that makes sense to each in an effort to keep each engaged, right? For example, the imagery of light and darkness. When Rob read that, surely something that jumped out of you was how many times light gets mentioned. Light, 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 light. And light and darkness is imagery that's deeply connected with the creation story, right? It's deeply connected with what God did in the beginning, carrying on the theme. And so this, again, kept the Jewish listener engaged. However, again, John is so clever here. He picks this imagery because this was also completely associated with the Logos. You see, in Greek philosophy, the Logos was understood as the illuminating or the enlightening force behind creation. It was connected with dispelling the darkness. And so John cleverly uses language and imagery that's accessible and sympathetic to both worldviews that he's writing to. Look how he intertwines both as we read on. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. With him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, I've got to stop here. Because the word for overcome in the Greek is the word katalaben, right? And depending on what translation you have or what you've read in the past, it will either say, as it does here in the NIV, the darkness has not overcome it, or it will say understood. The darkness has not understood it. And again, John's choice of words here is just unbelievably astute. Because the word katalaben actually means both, depending on the context. And so a Jew listening to this with a Jewish worldview, thinking about how in creation light penetrated the darkness, would hear this as overcome. A Greek who's picturing the enlightening light of the Logos would hear this and understand it as understood. That the darkness could not understand, was not enlightened as the light. I mean, holy John-oly, right? Come on. John's that good. Verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only to witness to the light. The true light that gives light, oh my gosh, light to everything and everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. And this is where, having masterfully straddled both worldviews, John now is about to drop a bomb. You see, we know the rest of the passage, right? We know the rest of the Bible. We know that John is talking about Jesus, right? But his listeners didn't know that yet. And had he just come out with this straight off the bat, that Jesus was the divine word, they would have been deeply offended and stopped listening immediately. But John has now built such a flow and a cadence with what he's saying. He's got them engaged that by the time his hearers realize what he's about to say next, John has already made his point. Verse 9. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Now, the Jews' ears would have been beginning to prick up here, right? They would have been going, hang on, is this guy talking about that bloke Jesus, the rabbi? Verse 12, yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Now the Greeks' ears would have pricked up. Hang on. Humans can't become the children of the gods. What's going on here? Verse 13, children not born of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. And now he drops both the focal point of his prologue and the summary of his entire gospel in this epic one-liner. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from heaven, full of grace and truth. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, you have to understand that this was a claim of crazy proportions, both to a Jewish and a Greek person, right? I mean, John has just laid out his case that the Word was divine, that the Word was with God, that the Word was God. Now he's saying that Word was this man from Nazareth called Jesus. Like, to a Jew, that would have been total heresy. In fact, ultimately, this is what got Jesus crucified, right? Him claiming to be God. Well, for a Greek, this also sounded like complete heresy on so many levels. Firstly, the Logos was not a person. It was this abstract force. Secondly, if somehow it could be personified, in Greek philosophy, in the Greek worldview, there was this stark dichotomy for the Greek between the spirit and the body. The spirit, as much as it kind of mirrored the divine, was understood as sacred, as inherently good. The body or the flesh was literally the opposite. It was loathsome. And so to suggest that the divine Logos became flesh, again for a Greek, would have just been so problematic. And yet, this was the claim that John was making here about Jesus. That he was the eternal divine Logos, and that Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And really, the remainder of John's gospel seeks to unpack this very idea. Seeks to unpack all the signs and wonders, the miracles, the words and the wisdom of this man, Jesus of Nazareth, in an effort to compel his hearers that this man, Jesus, really was incarnate. That he really was the Word who became flesh. And so before we finish today, I want to take a quick second to sit in this radical idea. I want to take a second to sit in the nature of this radical idea. The Word became flesh. Because often I think as Christians, we hear this, right? We know this. But we don't stop to consider really how profound it is. And so I want to highlight 3 elements this morning about the incarnation that make it so profound. And the first is this, that God took initiative. Now, I realize I'm potentially about to implicate myself in saying what I'm about to say, particularly in my marriage, and forgive me now if I unintentionally implicate you in yours. But I thought a lot about what I'm about to say, and I can't help but believe that this is true. In fact, I've got an original Matt Hornby quote to give you. On my 100th sermon, this is the first original Matt Hornby quote I've ever given. Are you ready? Here's the quote. Real love takes initiative. Real love takes initiative. I want you to think about this. If I'm sitting on the couch at home after a long day of work and I'm tired, and Bianca has had to take the baby to bed early because he's sick or he's tired or whatever, and I look over and see a messy, dirty dining room table, and I justifiably go, ha, that's her job, and go back to watching the basketball, who knows that if I do that, it's not that I don't love Bianca, but who knows that I don't love her well in that moment. But who knows, while my love isn't real in the sense that it hasn't matured, it hasn't properly developed in that moment, if I'm not prepared to take the initiative to do something that I know means something to her. You know, I was thinking about this in relation to my role here as a pastor, right? I've been here for 2.5 years. And there are certain things that I have not done in the entire time that I've been here, particularly as it pertains to admin or policy, that I knew had to be done. But I didn't do them. Because I didn't love these things, and so I never did these things. Mate, it took hiring an executive pastor to get some of that stuff sorted, praise the Lord. However, on the contrary, I want you to hear this. I think it was literally my second week here that not only did I commit, and I'm not sure if the previous pastor did this, not only did I commit to attending regularly and breathing new life into our existing prayer group, but I started 2 more. Why? Because I love prayer. I believe in prayer. Prayer works. And so taking the initiative to create more opportunities and encourage more people to pray more often was very easy for me because I love prayer. Real love takes initiative. And this is one of the mind-blowing facts about the incarnation. God didn't just sit there taking bets from the angels about how long it would take humanity to get their act together. He didn't say, well, you know, if they ask me enough and if they really mean it, then maybe I'll get involved. Maybe then I'll make a way. No, he took initiative, amen? Before the foundation of the world, he had already purposed in his heart that he would bridge the gap. That he would send his one and only son. Church, the first element of the incarnation that we cannot ignore is that God took initiative. Number 2, God took initiative for our benefit. Have you ever stopped to think about this? Have you ever stopped to think about what God got out of the incarnation? You ever thought about what was it in for him? What was it for him? What was in it for him? You know what I'm saying. I'll tell you the correct answer. Ready? Nothing. Nothing. We were the sole beneficiaries. And again, we say things like that all the time, but could you imagine, let's put skin on this, if you entered into a business partnership with someone under the agreement that you would do all of the work, you would carry all of the burden, but you literally got none of the profit. Like, God didn't need rescuing, did he? None of this was his fault, and yet he was the one that took the initiative for our benefit. You know, I said to a friend the other day these words: I really value your friendship. And you know what struck me? Probably for the first time in my life, as I said those words, I value your friendship. That meant, by definition, that person was bringing value into my life. That's an incredibly sobering thought, right? I mean, it's wonderful if you can say that about someone in your life, that you value their friendship, that they bring value into your life, but can anyone say that about you? Does anyone value your friendship? Can your spouse or colleague or gym buddy ever honestly say that you bring value into their life? Like, what a thought, right? And seeing as I'm full of original quotes this morning, I'll give you another. Let's double up. Real love brings value. Real love isn't, and I want you to hear this, it is not about reciprocating to the degree that you feel you've received. That's called imitation. Replicating like for like. But that's not love. No, real love brings value. Real love brings benefit. It brings advantage or ascendancy as a gift for the other. It's not for yourself. It's for the other. And that is the heartbeat of the incarnation. God took initiative for our benefit. Lost my clicker. Well, the final element of the incarnation I want to highlight is not just that God took initiative. It's not just that God took initiative for our benefit, but that God took initiative for our benefit at his cost. Who enjoys a good love story? Come on. Be honest. Who enjoys a good love story? Hollywood do these particularly well, don't they? You know the love stories that get us the most, though? They're the ones that are the most iconic. They're the ones that portray a love that's prepared to carry the cost. A love that's prepared to undergo great sacrifice. You think about it. I'm thinking stories like The Notebook. God, I love The Notebook. Or Les Mis. Or Romeo and Juliet. Or here's the best one, Titanic. Now, we love these love stories, right? And the question is why? I'll tell you. Because they're inspirational. Now, hear this. They're not particularly true to reality, right? They don't capture reality. That's not why we love them. We love them because they inspire us, and we love getting lost in the fantasy. I mean, seriously, who gives up their life savings and their time to restore a house in the hope that an ex-lover might, out of the blue, decide to love you again? It's literally the plot of one of those movies. Like, you just don't see that kind of stuff in the real world, do you? And that's the problem. You see, even in our most intimate relationships, rarely are we prepared to love in a way that actually costs us. I mean, for all the things we're scared of, right? Tight spaces, claustrophobia. Spiders, arachnophobia. Heights, acrophobia. There should definitely be a costophobia. Because anything that looks or smells like it's going to cost us, especially if we're not going to benefit in any way, man, we're out of there. And yet this was the hallmark of the incarnation. I mean, not only was it God's active initiation, not only did it purely and squarely benefit us, but all of that was at His cost. You know, there's probably a few verses in the Bible that I love as much as Philippians 2, verse 6 to 8. Paul is writing and he's talking about Jesus, and he writes this: who being, whoa, have I lost it? I don't have it. Let me just tell you. Who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance of a man, the incarnation. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. I mean, there was so much cost on his end that I could literally talk for the next 3 hours just about it. But you know the cost that blows my brain the most? It was the cost, hear this, of self-restraint. It was the cost of self-restraint in his love. Think about it. How unbearable is it to be accused of something that you didn't do? Even worse, if you ever have to suffer unjustly for it. Like, all you want to do is tell anyone and everyone that would listen that I'm innocent. Now imagine actually having the power, the literal authority and agency to at any moment say, stuff you, I'll show you how it is, I'm in the right. And yet Jesus didn't do it once. He didn't do it once. Instead, he hung on a cross and said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. I mean, what cost? Ravi Zacharias says, Christianity is the only religion that teaches the incarnation, God becoming human. This is the most profound and radical claim of all religions. And isn't it? That God took initiative for our benefit at his cost. Church, there is nothing more important, more compelling that John wants us to catch in his introduction than this, that the Word became flesh. But here's the ultimate kicker this morning. The incarnation is not just an inspiration, it's an invitation. The fact that God took initiative for our benefit at his cost isn't just something that we sit back and admire, it's something we're called to apply. To take initiative for someone else's benefit, for the kingdom's benefit at our cost. This is literally what it means to be a disciple, right? A follower, an imitator of Jesus. And the reality is, I meet far too many Christians, far too many people leaving marriages, leaving jobs, leaving churches and opportunities because it's not how I like it. because my needs aren't being met, or it's not an environment that's conducive to me. And I just want to scream and say, yeah, welcome to the life of the incarnation. How on earth do you think you experience salvation? Because God took initiative for our benefit at His cost. How on earth do you think God's kingdom is going to come and His will be done? How on earth do you think salvation is going to come to your marriage, is going to come to your colleague, is going to come to your neighbor or your grandchild? I'll tell you, the same way it did through Jesus, by taking initiative for another's benefit at your cost. Church, this is the powerful, life-changing work of the kingdom. This is the invitation of the incarnation. The only question is this: are you in or are you out? Let's pray.